Today we're going to talk about point of view. This is something you don't hear enough about in screenwriting. You always hear about character and structure, but point of view can totally affect whether or not the audience gives a shizzle about your screenplay. And I'd say close to a third to a half of all amateur scripts I read have point of view madness. I'll tell you all about it. Point of view basically answers the question, whose story is this? It helps give the context for your story. It tells you what scenes belong in the script and which don't. Because your story probably takes place over a long period of time, but you don't show every moment. You don't show them brushing their teeth, brushing their hair, eating breakfast, checking their phone, checking Facebook. You only want what is pertinent to the story. So you have to figure out whose story is it to determine what scenes are pertinent to that story. It also helps give your story emotional resonance, so you understand what to feel because you're putting the audience in one of your character's shoes. If I told you that today I was walking down the street and I saw this little boy who was missing an arm and he was crying and I found out his cat is stuck in the tree and the cat's been up there for like a week and the cat's really thin and stuck on a branch and bleeding. So we called the fire department and the fireman shows up, and one of the firemen, his wife actually died in childbirth the day before, but he showed up to work anyway because half of his fire station were all at the hospital with smoke inhalation because they'd been at this big fire downtown. So they're trying to get the cat out of the tree, and then the little old lady whose yard it was, whose tree it was, she comes hobbling out and she had this like really creepy attendant that was there, and he kept saying like really mean things to her and was calling her an idiot and telling her to get back in the house, and he held his hand up to her and she kind of flinched and she had bruises on her arm, like I'm sure this guy's like beating her. It's like if I told you the story and I just pummel you with all this stuff, you start to just be distant from it. You know, you're just listening to this and it registers on an intellectual level, but you're not feeling anything because we're not putting you in anyone's shoes. So your story needs some kind of context. We have to put you in someone's shoes to understand the story, to get you emotionally connected. Now, that doesn't mean that the point of view character has to be the one with the most screen time. If you take the movie like The Shawshank Redemption, it was told from the point of view of Red, and you're seeing the story of Andy as it relates to his experience and the decisions he makes because of him seeing Andy's story, but he's not necessarily the main character, the one with the most screen time. Or if you take Princess Bride, the story is actually the point of view of the little boy being told this story, so we're seeing it the same way he is, but he's not necessarily the one with the most screen time. So it doesn't necessarily have to be your character with the most screen time. You just have to figure out whose point of view is the story being told from. That gives the audience an emotional way into your story, and it's going to color what you include and what you don't include. So what are the issues that I normally see in scripts? Normally I see there's just really no point of view character, no main character. We're just getting like snippets here and there of all this stuff. Kind of like that story I just told you. We've got the one-armed boy and the poor little cat, and this firefighter, his wife died, and the little old lady, and it's just a jumble. It's kind of a mess. And again, the audience is just going to be distant from your story. And I think this happens either because the screenwriter is coming at this very left-brained and thinking about the plot and how the plot turns and what happens at the plot, and not really thinking about the arcs of the characters or the emotions of the characters. Or this can happen because it's based on a true story or it's a historical story and the person's done so much research, they want to include all these details, and now the story's getting lost in all these details. Or someone can just be so enamored with every little moment that they think about how is this character feeling, and this is going on with this character, and then how is this character feeling, what's going on with them. It's like you have to make choices. You've got to narrow it down. I always think of it as dual entry accounting. I was an accountant for 10 years, and the situation with accounting is, let's say I am a store owner and I sell a candy bar. So if I sell the candy bar and I get $1, I can't just put on the books that I got $1. Accounting is dual entry. If you put $1 on the cash register, that has to come from somewhere else. So the corresponding entry in accounting, you're learning accounting now, is sales. So I would credit the sales account and debit the cash register account. Well, also I have to take that candy bar now out of inventory. So I can't just go to the books and take it out of inventory. It's always dual entry. So I take the candy bar out of inventory, and the other side of that is cost of goods sold. So with a script, anytime you are investing time into another character, it's like dual entry accounting. There's not just one side to that. You are taking away from other things in the script. So you're diluting other stories anytime you shell out. So you need to think about that when you're writing. Anytime you've got a scene with another character, we're taking away from a different character, or we might be taking away from our main character. It also affects the experience of the audience. When you put us really squarely in one person's shoes and we stay there, we really can experience that whole story. So like the movie Castaway, when we're there with Tom Hanks and we're experiencing everything he was experiencing, it would be different if they were constantly shelling out to the Coast Guard trying to find him, and his mom back home worried about where he is, and his friend worried about where he is, and didn't just keep us in that situation. So it can also ruin the experience as well. So a lot of the scripts just have different characters and we just kind of bounce back and forth, and it's really about a situation and not really a character. But how I actually see this happen probably the most is the screenwriter will start the script very strongly sole protagonist with single point of view until about the midpoint. And then it goes crazy. I don't know why this happens. I have a guess. I think it's because the screenwriter hasn't really determined how this journey, how this story affects the character's arc. So they understand how to set up the character and they kind of set up the arc, but this journey really doesn't address the flaw they've created, or maybe they don't have a flaw, or maybe they don't have a character arc. So that's why it just kind of explodes in the middle. So you got to check your story and make sure you don't go very tightly sole protagonist till about the midpoint, and then we start shelling out and going all over the place. I also see a lot of screenplays that are so ridiculously heavily populated. There is no way we can ever connect to any of the characters because there's like 15 main characters. I'm not kidding. I'll read scripts where there's like 15 main characters and we're going bounce, 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 bounce all over the place. Another problem when it comes to point of view is if the audience is in an inferior position. What does that mean? The audience inferior. That means the audience doesn't know as much as the character that we're following. So let's say it's a detective movie and we've been following the point of view of that detective all throughout. Well, then all of a sudden the detective shows up and confronts the killer and says, "I know you did it, Bob, because I just got a phone call from Susie and she said you weren't there that night." And we're like, wait a second, what? Like something happened when we weren't around, which feels like a fake out. It feels like a trick because we were kind of promised we were experiencing this character's story and then all of a sudden we're not. That is going to be very disappointing to your audience if the audience all of a sudden doesn't know as much as your point of view character suddenly, randomly, usually at the end. So be careful about having the audience in an inferior position. A similar problem happens if the audience is in a superior position, meaning we start maybe strongly point of view of a certain character, but then all of a sudden we become omnipotent and we start to see things that character doesn't know. Not only does this make us feel distant from the character, we can't really experience what they're experiencing with them. We're also now bored out of our mind because we're sitting there waiting for the guy to catch up to what we already know. So audience superior positions, they just suck the suspense and mystery out of your story and make it harder to emotionally connect to your lead. Okay, so even though it does make it harder for the audience to connect to a story, if you're kind of doing an ensemble piece or you're bouncing around or that kind of thing, there are no rules in screenwriting except for the one rule that is, don't be boring. So you can do ensemble pieces, you can do stories that are about a situation, but you'll hear a lot of advice to screenwriters to say not to do that, to stick to sole protagonists. And it's usually because, you know, when you're a little kid, you're not allowed to use the big sharp scissors. You have to have the round scissors because you're a little dangerous. You might run with them, you might poke them in your head, but then when you know what you're doing a little bit better, then you can have the big scissors. So doing ensemble pieces and things that shell out a bit more and don't stick to a single point of view, they absolutely can be done, but they're just harder because a screenplay is like a body. You kind of can't separate the parts. So if you hurt your right arm, you have to lean more heavily on your left arm. In a screenplay, if you don't have the benefit of a singular point of view and you follow that same character throughout, it weighs more heavily on all the other elements. So then your characters have to be spot on and amazing. Your execution has to be incredible. Your premise has to be different. It just puts that much more weight on everything else. And you've got to find another way to get the audience invested in your story strongly if you're not giving them a single person's journey. And that is possible if it's a really interesting tone and has amazing dialogue and is just snazzy and cool. You can sometimes get away with it. Or if it's some kind of situation the audience has instant investment in, like The Big Short did not follow one single person throughout the whole story. It bounced around to different aspects of the story. But there was a lot of investment in the audience in that story because everyone was affected by the US economy tanking in the late 2000s. So the audience is invested going, how did this happen? What happened? Because it affected them. So you can get away sometimes without having strong point of view characters that you're following the whole time. But it's like advanced ninja black belt. And more often than not, it's really difficult to do. And you have to understand if the audience isn't invested because they're strongly connected to this single character, what does create audience investment? Why does the audience care? But with most stories I see, they're decent stories, but they're just diluting the story and making us feel like we're changing channels to different movies throughout the story by just bouncing all over the place. And when you don't make this decision, whose story is it, then that affects your character because now we don't have like a character arc to really follow. That also affects the plot because now the character arc doesn't quite fit the plot. It just kind of makes everything fall apart. So it's a huge decision you need to make in the very beginning of writing your story is whose story is it? And again, doesn't necessarily have to be the character with the most screen time, but it's just the perspective to give your story context. Another thing to keep in mind with point of view when you're deciding whose story is this, whose shoes are we in, do we stay with them the whole time, or is it an ensemble, is casting, because stars want to be the star. They're going to want to be in every scene, and agents, managers, producers, they also know that, and they're going to be looking for star vehicles. So if your screenplay very solidly puts us in someone's shoes and we feature that person throughout, it's going to be instantly more marketable, castable, producible. When you start shelling out all over the place, not as castable. So that's an issue to also take into consideration with the point of view. I hope this helped you. If it did, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will talk to you later. Bye.